Dot.
Hello, welcome to another Rust and WebAssembly working group meeting. Uh, all right, right off the bat, I just want to mention that the template for our meetings, our schedule template, has changed a bit. I've updated this to reflect essentially our goals for the for 2019 from the roadmap. So RFC triage, there is a proposed amendment to the RFC process, which is mostly relevant if you are a core member of the working group. So read that and take a look if you'd like. And jumping along into status updates. So the glue toolkit is the name for the modular toolkit that we intend to build. It is not really ready to be built yet. I've been trying to create a bunch of like contributor docs and kind of like checklists and things like this. So I will continue doing that, and hopefully by this time next week, it will actually be ready for people to be contributing to it. Multi-threading. Alex, you have a link.
Yeah, but given the opportunity to talk about this, we do actually have a little bit, which is, so there's a PR linked here, which is enabling Rayon to be compatible with WebAssembly threads and everything. And so I have a work in progress of starting to get that used. And so I have like a very ad hoc demo of actually using Rayon for the ray tracing example that we currently have. So it's making progress. It still is very, very buggy, and so working through some things there. One was fixing the memory allocator in the standard library, so I'm just waiting for that to get to nightly. After that, we can probably make some more progress here. So it's coming along, but it's still going to take a little bit to get kind of like a Rayon style demo, and also an ergonomic Rayon style demo.
Nice. Have you tried any of the little tweaks that CU Viper suggested about trying to get the performance on par with the hand-rolled threading?
No, not yet. I've gotten to the point where I can hit the button and like 50% of the time it actually works to get a measurement, and so it was like it wasn't really that much slower than before, but I suspect that like doing some coarser grain parallelism rather than every single pixel is going to make it just as fast as the previous version, if not a little bit faster. So I'm not actually too worried about performance. That was just something I wanted to bring up.
Mm. And then the reason you say 50% of the time is because of the issues with the allocator?
And there's some seg fault somewhere. I don't know where. I'm hoping that once I fix the allocator one, I can move beyond that and find the next one.
Cool. So the allocator thing, for the people who aren't familiar, is that the main thread can't block and like wait on a mutex or a convar or anything like that. So allocation on the main thread, the allocator is shared with all the worker threads as well, right? So like if another worker thread is using the allocator and the main thread wants to allocate, what do you do? That's essentially the short version of the problem. Debugging. I don't think we have any updates here. The main thing is we want it and we need a plan.
One thing we might want to put, like try and figure out more in the long term is the whole point of Walrus for internally being used in WASM-BindGen is for a large part of it is preserving dwarf debug information. And so I wonder if, Nick, if there's something you and we can do that's like to kick off some contribution areas, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or if that's just like we need to put a fair amount of work in to get a skeleton in place and then we can start having more contributors from there.
Yeah. I think it would be good to sit down and come up with a plan for exactly like what we want the final like code to look like in Walrus, and then at least write that up and then see if we can chop it into the pieces that can kind of be handed out to folks who don't have the whole picture in their head.
That makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Toolchain and workflow polish. This is largely WASM-Pack stuff. Do we have any WASM-Pack updates?
So I definitely missed my deadline that I had set for myself to get WASM-Pack 0.7 out by February 15th. But that has the kind of nice benefit of the fact that we can probably get the 1.0 CLI output PR that Alex has made in for that release, and definitely hit March 15th, if not really kind of the end of this week probably. In order to merge that, I'm going to need to pull it down and regenerate some GIFs and check that out. So that's something that I need to do. I think there's also another one for fixing WebAssembly on Rust up setups that we should probably be able to get in. It looks like there's something that's causing all of our tests to fail currently, which I think is a cargo test -- locked issue, if I'm seeing things correctly, but I'll need to check that out. But that is where that is at.
Cool, thank you. All right, monitoring, profiling, and testing infrastructure.
So I talked a couple of weeks ago about kind of tracking WebAssembly sizes over time. This is not the profiling aspect, just the how big our binaries and JS things are. And so the second link here is a GitHub Pages generated website, which has no contextual information. It's just a bunch of numbers. But the idea here is that this has been periodically updated over the past week automatically. And so this is just kind of we fire and forget. And the rough idea is that there's a number of benchmarks and metrics we want to track on it. So for example, the first one here is Twiggy, which is Twiggy, the repository has a WASM API thing, and so it just CDs into that and runs WASM-pack build and then measures everything. And so this measures, like the top line is just the actual WASM coming out of WASM bindgen, and then that orange line is then if you actually gzip it. So in theory, we can get maybe a sense of like a 100 byte increase in WASM doesn't matter that much because it's 2 bytes of an increase in something else, or I don't know. But so I'm not sure how useful this is, but I wanted to say I just wanted to put this up as something that I've been working on and see if others have thoughts of how to make this more useful than it currently is, which is a bunch of flat lines. One thing I would actually point out as well is if you, at the top, there's this checkbox saying show absolute data. So if you uncheck that, you'll actually see that on the game of life, for example, there's a really big spike of an increase in size. And then if you mouse over that, it'll show you that changes were actually related to WASM bindgen, or WASM bindgen released a new version. And so this is showing that for that benchmark, we're creating 15% bigger binaries. I'm not sure the numbers are right, but in theory. And so that was a known change we made on WASM bindgen. And so, but then
is this related to the text encoder stuff?
Right, so the JS got a little bit bigger, and then also the WASM got a little bit bigger because now we're putting in realloc and things. But so I don't really know how to interpret this. Where like if you show relative data from the left-hand most point, you can actually see some nice spikes in what's going on there. But if you go back to the absolute data, you'll notice how you can barely tell any difference at all. So I don't really know what the best way to do to measure this is, and maybe it's just good to have a smorgasbord of stuff here so we can just track and just be aware of changes. But yeah,
I haven't dove too deep into this yet because this is the first time seeing it, but maybe we should default to showing the relative, since that seems like the more useful view, at least on my immediate look. And then just because it gives us that like change over time view, which is what I think we were mostly looking for, at least for us on the team. That would be like my first suggestion.
Yeah.
I agree with that totally.
It might also be useful. I mean, this is like huge feature request, so we probably won't get there. But if there was a way to look at like the versions and a way to like click into like a change log or a release, that might be kind of nice, because then we can, because like when you see changes, the first question you usually ask is like, oh, there's a change. Why did that change happen? And I see that there's a link to the Rust C changes. Oh, wait, never mind. Actually, you have this if you hover over, but I just noticed that.
It's there for some of them. I didn't hook it up yet for crate versions because I would have to translate that to tags. But I think for like WASM bindgen, we can whitelist like WASM bindgen and say like, oh, here's the tags we know are there, and then here's like the URL for the tags. So we can get some
cool. Maybe even like some help text that says like hover over the line to see like the stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean having any amount of explanatory of like what is the
Sure, I can make PRs to help with that too. This is great though, Alex. Thanks so much for this work.
So I mean, and then one thing I wanted to point out as well is I personally like the idea of relative as opposed to absolute. But one of the downsides of that is that if this is it's unlikely to show good information where it's probably just going to be a bunch of like, hey, look, we're always up and to the right, or like we're getting a little bit more over and over. But so it may not be in terms of that would be purely internal as opposed to a publicity style thing. But I don't know if we also want this to be a publicly available like, hey, come see how we're tracking things over time. But,
I think even if it's always up and to the right, at least for now, like I like the idea of being honest about where we're at, like the fact that it's always getting bigger. If there was maybe some sort of like one thing that you could say is like, so we're showing the size as like a percentage, but it might be useful to show some sort of absolute, like, this is the size of like an equivalent JavaScript something, so that like you can compare, like maybe we're always up and to the right, but like the JS version of this is like all the way up here. So like we were smaller, something to like give like slightly more context, because up and to the right with no context would always seem like it's getting worse. Um, but I don't know. Also, maybe showing speed somehow on this, which is like a huge nightmare and will require a lot more design, might help to show that there's like a trade-off between size and speed potentially.
that's true.
But yeah, I think trying to give some context, but in general, I think just being honest would be useful. The absolute numbers are nice, but I'll admit when I first landed on the page, it kind of looked like maybe it wasn't working. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. So if we put the JS equivalent JS size there as well, like the issues I expect that we'll run into are like, like what is writing the equivalent JS? Like there's lots
Yeah.
of things that like are sort of equivalent but not really, and like it's a whole can of worms. And then the JS is probably actually smaller in general because like one thing in JS does more than like one instruction of WebAssembly, right? And so like this kind of gets into like the classic like asterisk we have for all of our size profiling, which is like size isn't actually the thing that you care about. It's a proxy for the thing you care about. And the thing you really care about is time to load or like time to interactivity. And that's
Yeah.
hard to measure.
One
So
thing that we maybe could do that's like a much better idea than like the equivalent JS is like, I assume that we probably have some sort of, maybe not a specific one, but like kind of a magic number on our heads where if we saw it, we'd go, oh, that's definitely too big. And so perhaps if we can just like give some sort of like when we all see the graph, like kind of hit that point, like we all kind of have like a gut check that goes, oh, we like, that's probably wrong. We should go check something. Maybe just giving that type of context would help people like see the graph also, to be like, basically it says we see this graph and even though it's going up and to the right, we're not worried. To like give them some sort of like understanding of like, oh, this is good versus bad versus this is expected versus not.
yeah, I would also question the whole up and to the right thing. Like we expected it for the realix stuff, but like this shouldn't just always continue.
Yeah, I would
Yes,
hope that it goes back down. I'm sure that we'll get there, or at least stay relatively flat.
Yeah. Sorry, I think I interrupted you, Yash.
A fun metric that I sometimes apply is like how many data packets can we fit it? It's like, oh, we now need 5 TCP packets. It's like, if you don't consider the growing thing. And we're like, cool, we're now down to 3. And it's like, oh, cool, benchmark or achievement. Might be fun. I don't know.
I like one thing that I think would be really cool is to have annotations on here. I would love to see like I want to, after we see a spike or an inflection point, say like, oh, this is why. Like I want to annotate on here saying 0228 or like, oh, whatever the new WebAssembly version is, like this is the exact PR that did it. This is exactly what we know, and or like, and either here's the bug fix or here's the person to go praise because they made it 20% smaller. So
Right. Or the reason why we chose this is like a valid trade-off. Cool.
All right. Well, in any case, we don't have to discuss this for too long. I mostly wanted to make this aware. I don't have a ton of ideas of where to go from here, other than I know there's some micro benchmarks that Nick you have that I want to make sure I include here somehow because I want to have some
Mhm.
suite of that. But if other people have like, if you have a general project like just something using Wasm Bindgen, something using Wasm Pack or Webpack, anything in between, just let me know, and I'd love to get that on here because this just basically pulls down the master version, and so it'll track changes that you make to Rust, changes to Webpack, changes to WasmPack, changes to WasmBindgen, changes to your own source code, all that stuff. And so the theory, we can just kind of see how it's going over time.
I think that we might talk to Surma about using the Squish app stuff because he also has that for like different tool chains. And I feel like he is motivated to maintain it, which is a benefit.
That would be great.
Cool. So next agenda item is basically in the leading up to the Rust 2018 edition, we kind of synced our sprints with the Rust release cycle. So like every 6 weeks, we kind of like did a little planning session and chose what do we think we could do in the next 6 weeks and tried to have, you know, soft time limits for ourselves and ship things. And I'm wondering if people feel like that's a useful kind of organizational tool to do, you know, outside of the Rust 2018 edition. Like if we'd like to just every 6 weeks kind of step back and try and set goals for the next 6 weeks.
I like that idea. I think it's nice to have a sense, particularly when you want to get contributors to like have some sort of plan to be like, these are the things to work on. And being able to flag those, I think works. And I'm trying to do a monthly release sesh with Wasm Pack, but 6 weeks should be definitely doable. Like that's exactly where we're at right now. But I like the idea of having some sort of cadence so we can feel like we're making progress towards something. So I'm a big fan.
I saw it on the agenda and I proposed it to the async working group meeting an hour ago, and people also seem into it. So yeah, very much.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think this meeting then is probably not the one where we'll do the next 6 weeks because we've already been talking a bunch. But probably next week we can sit down and do the whole, you know, nomination of issues and everything. And one thing that I thought worked particularly well the last time we did this was having a single issue label that we can use across all of our organization's repositories, because that way you can see the whole list of everything in one place. And like I was sorting that by least recently updated, which was really useful for like finding things that no one else was working on, essentially. All right. And Jay, would you like to talk about the bookshelf?
Yes. So we got the bookshelf merged. Hooray. I opened another PR to see if we could get the Wasm bookshelf merged into the Rust bookshelf. And there was a little bit of discussion there that they would prefer to not link to external documentation, that if we would like to have a Rust and WebAssembly book brought in, that we should create a submodule that we can import. And so there are some pros and cons, and they linked me to a PR where the embedded working group was kind of trying to figure out the same thing for themselves. So that should be something that is discussed and thought about, I guess. The pros are like greater visibility for this documentation. One of the major cons is that you would have to PR in order to update the docs.
And there's a 6-month release schedule, right? Because these are the docs that are also bundled with like Rust C.
Oh, I didn't know it was a 6-month.
Or not 6 months, sorry, 6 weeks.
Okay, I was like,
Sorry,
6 months is a really long time.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, 6 months is absurd. I apologize. So if we're going back to this whole like kind of 6 week sprint situation that might actually work out real well.
Yeah. So I can throw a link to the PR where they hashed out that conversation if you would like.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Can you share also the link to the PR you sent to the bookshelf
Yes.
folks? Yeah, so it's more than just 6 weeks of latency because it has to ride the trains as well,
Yeah.
right? So it's like 6 weeks until the first beta, and then 6 weeks from beta till stable. Which I don't know. I guess we can discuss this in an issue and like read over all the discussion and everything. But that just seems like such a long time for our tool chain that's moving relatively fast.
I would imagine that maybe the book would be good for this, so like the Game of Life tutorial, because it isn't changing at the same velocity as WASM Bindgen and WASM Pack. But I don't think that those books would be suitable for inclusion for submodule inclusion into Rustling Rust. No, I would like to make a stronger case for why we should be externally linked and at this time, but I don't want to reopen old wounds, and that's not something to discuss here. That's something to discuss.
I don't think that it's a wound necessarily. I did ask why there was a preference to not link to external docs in the PR, so feel free to drop a comment in if you think that that would be appropriate to link externally instead.
So we had this conversation briefly when we were talking about the 2018 edition website and the docs and just releasing the edition. And I think, I could be wrong here, but I think it's largely preferable for it to be bundled in because the experience of Ruststock Open and being able to do that thing locally is what is desired to be mapped to what is published on the bookshelf. And so I think fundamentally that's really the reason. But again, we do also have the website which links out to all of the other docs, and I think that's supposed to be kind of understood to be the trade-off visibility-wise.
Okay.
But again, I think it's totally worth asking and getting like documented in an issue, but I had the same question because I was like, why do we have to bundle all the books into the, like, why do we have to do this? And that was what I was told.
Okay.
A wild idea is we could have a situation where we have a little bit of JS that like attempts to fetch the latest sources, and like if it can't get them, it can't get them, and you get like whatever submodule version, and if it can get them, well, then get the latest. I don't know if we really want to do that.
I do really like the idea, like if you think about what is generally contained in the Rust bookshelf, I think the Game of Life tutorial is like a very valid, like good thing to include. And while yes, there's like the reference API in the bookshelf, Rust obviously moves slower than our libraries do. And so I think just having the Game of Life tutorial and then like we could just create stub pages that are like, to read the most up-to-date version of this, like click this link. And we still get the visibility aspect of it.
Or like a banner, like similar to how we're talking about like master versus last release documentation.
Yeah. And kind of on that note, I did write up some notes to switch the Game of Life tutorial to use no modules. So that's still a work in progress, and hopefully I will have something pushed up for that before next week.
Cool. Yeah, so a couple things on that note is that we might want to use the new, whatever we end up calling it, flag for WASM Bindgen that uses ES modules but doesn't require a bundler. Because I think that's a direction we would want to generally go.
I will say though that will be that'll require a new release of both WASM Bindgen and WASM Pack, because we're gonna want to definitely gonna want to use WASM Pack in the book, and it's gonna need a new flag for new flags. And so if you switch to new modules, I think that's totally fine as an interim step. I think, because it's pretty easy to switch from no modules to dash dash web or whatever we call it. And so I wouldn't want to, I don't want to block improvements on the book just because we haven't done a WASM by gen or WASM pack release yet.
Right.
Adding a new flag that just like maps something that wasn't by gen does is not too hard though. And since, I mean, if it's something that we wanted to do like before the next WASM pack release, I'd be willing to commit to do that work so we can get it out so it's not blocking. I do think there was an issue just recently filed, I believe, on WASM bind gen. We might, I guess some of this is in some of the RCs, but we might want to do a short review of what we call these targets and where we expect them to work, because it does seem like there's largely a fair amount of confusion. And I also, just based on comments I've read from folks, I think we all kind of agree that we like don't love the names. Like I think we've all written in comments like, this name's not great, but it means this. And since we're early in the process and don't have to have stable APIs yet, like maybe we should like take a look and make sure that these are the names we really want. And like talk about them like maybe in one of these meetings or something. Because I think getting, like we've been in our little world of our flags for a while. And so I think we have like, we've acclimated to them, but getting new people to be like, this is not at all what I expected this to do. Or like this new name means something else to me would be very helpful, I think.
Yeah, and doing, I know we've looked a little bit before at like what TypeScript does or other, you know, similar projects that have to make similar decisions. But, you know, informing our decisions based on what they've done in their prior art also useful.
Ergonomics is mostly familiarity, so figuring out what everyone else does is incredibly useful.
Yep. All right. Any other agenda items? We are out of pre-written agenda items.
Are we?
I think.
It seemed like we skipped the RFC, and I was curious to hear more about that.
Yeah. So there's just a failure mode of the current process where if like someone goes on vacation or has like life things going on where they're just otherwise unavailable, it can be very hard to like continue making progress.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an attempt to address that.
Okay.
For what it's worth, early on in Rust's history, we used to require full sign-off from everyone, and it was, I think it was a little bit before 1.0 or sometime after 1.0 we ended up starting realizing that it was way too hard to get full sign-off. It ended up it was always a reason one person or another was taken up or would take a long time to get around to it, and it ended up slowing down the process a lot more than it was. So I think it's worked out really well on Wrestling Rust to say that we don't need a 100%, but you need a very reasonable amount of time for everyone to say everything, and then otherwise most people to be on board. And so that's a big example I think I've seen of not having 100% sign off all the time can be a little bit slowing down for not the best reasons.
It is interesting to look at the precedent set by Rust because that is for merging an RFC, but it's not for stabilization. And because we have a more lightweight process, we kind of allied those. And I do think that, you know, I mean, again, it depends on which team you're looking at, but it is my understanding, and perhaps I'm wrong here, that the language team requires everybody to agree before stabilization. Is that correct?
It's certainly not correct for the library team. I don't know about the language team, so it might just be a team thing.
Got it. Yeah, so I'd love to comment on this RFC, and just to like state the elephant in the room, it's like, this is about me being unavailable for the last couple of months, like for sure. And I think the one thing that I just want to make sure that we're really careful about is I agree that there's a failure mode here, and I think that the things proposed in the RFC are not necessarily unreasonable. But I do wonder if this needed to be solved by legislation instead of just reaching out and going, hey, like we're really feeling held up. Can you like let us know what's up? I know at least for one of the RFCs that I felt like I was blocking on it, I realized that and I got pinged and I was like, all right, I'm just gonna like just say to ship it. But I also think that one of the other interesting differences between this team and some of the other teams is how incredibly small the core team is. And if we look at the makeup, I mean, even if we think about last year, it was also incredibly homogenous. All 3 people on the core team were full-time employees of Mozilla. And so I think I would be significantly more comfortable merging this RFC if we were able to expand the core team beyond people, because I don't want there to be a situation, and again, this is not suggesting that anyone is acting in a malicious way, but we don't want to be in a situation where we have a process that will preference folks who are working full-time on this specifically. And again, I don't think anyone would do that, but I think it's important to just like kind of keep an eye on that and obviously, you know, solve it before it ever would become a problem.
I totally agree. And I have actually been thinking similar things about expanding the team. I don't think this is the right venue to discuss that particular thing. But yeah, like in general, agreement.
Cool. And I guess I would also just say, like, to the extent that things are being held up in a way that's unacceptable, like, I definitely want to try and encourage this team. Like, we're small, like, we're new, we're close. We have, like, a great opportunity to just be able to, like, talk to each other. So we should do that. So if, like, things are going really slow and we don't like that, like, we should go, hey, person, like, what's up? Like, you having a bad time? Like, what's going on? And I think, particularly for a new project, like, we obviously can legislate this now, but working on building that interpersonal communication is going to make the team more robust in the long term than any type of policy we could possibly write.
I think that's really important. Thank you for discussing it.
All right. Any office hours things or other agenda items?
I can share a quick thing, which is the Node.js Collaborator Summit is going to happen in May in Berlin. So I'll probably just attend. Last year, I also attended last year, and there was at least one session about WASM. So I was thinking if anyone has anything or comes up with anything over the next 2 months that might be useful to discuss with Node.js people, I'm happy to act as an ambassador to the Node.js project and like represent the Rust WASM working group's views.
What dates are they, Yash?
Woo, that's a great question.
We don't have to solve this now. I'm just curious because I will be in Europe in early mid-May, so maybe I could try.
But May 30 and 31.
Right before JSConf EU, I guess.
Yes.
All right, makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. So I saw a tweet go by from Miles Borgen, I think is their name. Borens, yeah, about solving the module issue in Node.js, and that is very relevant to this working group's interests. So that's like the first thing that pops into my head.
Happy to attend any meetings around that and report back.
Miles DM'd me a PR to stabilize the ESM implementation in Node, so I think things are moving somewhat more quickly there, though do not seem entirely solved. But I'll share that in the. I don't know if folks saw that. Like I got it as a DM at like a midnight, like 3 days ago or something. So I have not looked too deeply into it, but there does seem to be an overwhelming feeling that that's been stabilized. So particularly for whatever WASM bindgen wants to do, and then what WASM pack wants to do around that, I think we'll probably need to. The tricky thing is we probably should have called the Node.js flag CommonJS because there's probably going to be 2 for a really long time. So we'll have to figure out. Naming is hard, but yeah.
All right. I think that's a meeting. Thank you all for coming, and I'll see you around the internet and talk to you next week.
Sweet. See ya.